Hello and welcome to another training session. Now today we're going to be taking a look back at Excel, but also looking at Power Query and Power BI at the same time. In Excel we're going to be having a look at how we can record a macro or write VBA. In fact, we're going to be writing some VBA as well, to record us actually doing a query in Excel. And one of the reasons for doing this is so that you can create a loop in VBA to do it, for example, for every single table in an Excel file as a separate query. And of course the Power BI comes in because once you've done this you can then import all of the data model that you've created in Excel. You can import that directly into Power BI. So let's get started. Here I have an empty Excel file. And I say empty, there's nothing in the connections. So if I go here, the queries and connections, at the moment I have no queries and no connections in this file. So you can see that here, 0 queries, 0 connections. And what we're going to start with is recording ourselves actually creating a query, and we're going to do this just as an example query, and then we'll test it and see how it works, and then I'll record another macro of us loading that query into the data model, and then we'll modify the code, we'll modify the VBA, and we'll build ourselves a loop, and we'll make it work on every single table in that file that we queried. So let's get started. Before we do, I've already saved this file and named it, and I've saved it XLSM, so macro enabled file type. That is important if you are going to be recording VBA and you want to save it in the file, because the recording, the VBA, when we load to the data model, it will load to the data model in this named sheet or named workbook, so you must have actually saved it and correctly put the extension on the end before you start. I've started recording a macro. I'm just going to call this one get data, and I click OK. It's being saved in this workbook, and the reason is because I've already named this as the XLSM file type. So it's now recording, and we can see that from down here on my status bar, and I'm just simply going to run the query, so get data from file from Excel in this case, and I'm going to get from a table in an Excel file. So I have this on my desktop, if I can find my desktop. And on my desktop I've got a folder called icons, and in there I've got my BI files and Excel, and there's the Excel file that we're going to interrogate. We'll see that there are a number of tables on this. In fact, in this case I think there's only 5, but it may be that your Excel that you're looking at may have hundreds or even thousands of tables on it. I'm going to do an example of just loading one of the tables, and then I'm going to create another query that loads whichever of these are tables into another table on my existing worksheet, and I will then run a loop to do it for each one of them. So I'll just hit transform data. We don't actually need to do the transform data step. We could have just directly loaded there, and that's something I don't normally tell people to do, is to directly load a query. So we've come in here, we've just checked. I'm not going to change the data types because that will refer to named columns, and that is then something that's not repeatable on other tables which have a different structure. So we need to be careful that we only do steps here that can be repeated on any other table. I'm going to go straight to close and load to. Now I could have just done close and load because I've changed my default settings here. Only create connection, and in fact to start with I'm not going to load it to the data model. So I click OK, and you'll see the connection gets loaded over there on the right. Now I've finished, I can stop recording. Just to demonstrate that this works, I will delete that query, and then I will go in and find the macro and run the macro. So here's the macro here under my view ribbon. There's my get data macro. When I hit run, it runs through, and there's the query that's created, and when I hover over it you'll see that it has actually got the relevant data, the headers have been promoted, and that the data is in the correct columns. Okay, that's the basic process. The second thing we'd want to do is record ourselves loading that into the data model. Before we do that, let's actually go and have a look at the code that was created for that. So here it is in the VBA, and we'll see that that get data macro has actually well, that one has actually loaded the connection there, and it's the first line here that is in fact all of the query. So if I scroll to the right, you'll see it says where to get the data from. It mentions the name of the file, and it then says what we want to do. We want to get a table which is named a certain name, and it's then going to load it in called that name and table. Down below, the next line is actually loading it into the data model. Let's have a look there. And if we see here, it's actually not loaded anything into the data model, and I could take that line of code out if I needed to, because it's basically saying don't load to the data model. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. So this line here, we don't actually need that, and that code will work fine as it is. Let's just test it. So we'll go back to the main workbook, we'll shut that one down, delete it, and then we'll try running our code again, and we'll see if it does work. There we go, it's loaded it as connection only. Now that second line that I deleted from my VBA, that is actually the code for me changing the connection and loading it into the data model. So again, if I hover over there, you'll see there's the code, or the result of the query as it is. If I start recording again, I'll leave this one called macro 2, and I'll right click here. I'm going to change the load to and make sure it's added to the data model this time. You'll see now it's loading the data. It'll come up with a number telling me how many rows are loaded. If it loads successfully, 480 rows loaded. That's fine. I will stop recording. Now let's go in and have a look at the data again, and you'll see there is the row of data that I deleted. It does have a slightly different look to it this time, and in fact anyone who goes back and looks at the previous one, you'd see there was an asterisk in there previously instead of the actual name of the actual table that we've loaded. The previous one was basically saying don't load anything, and this one is saying do load this one into the data model. Okay, I'm going to copy and paste. So I've copied all of this, in fact I've cut it, and I'm going to paste it into my first one. And I'm also just going to delete that scrap macro. Now, in order to make this work on multiple files, what we're first going to do is we're going to run a query, and in that query we're going to get a list of all the tables in this workbook. Now this does involve a little bit of trickery that a lot of people are not aware of, so let's get started. We're going to say get data. We're going to get data from an Excel workbook just like before, and it's going to be the same workbook. So this is the workbook that has our tables in the workbook. When we come up with the query, we're not going to choose an individual item here, and in fact we're not going to choose multiple items. What we're going to do instead is choose the whole Excel, what people refer to as a file, but is in fact a folder. Now if you look down here, you generally can't click transform. Transform button is not lit up for that, but you can right click on it and say transform data, and this will now bring up the metadata for every component that we can use within the Excel folder. And I'm going to refer to it as a folder even though most people think of it as a file. So within the Excel we have multiple things. We have tables, we have sheets, we have named ranges, and we have, for example, things like print areas, advanced filters. They all create defined names. I only want the tables, so I'm just going to use a basic search here or basic filter for the tables. And then once I've got the tables, I'm just going to choose the names by removing the other columns and just leaving me a column with the names of the tables. Now that's fine. This one I want to close and load to, and again I don't want it loading into the data model, but I do want it loading into a table, and let's put it on this existing page here. This will now give me a list of all of the tables that I have within that workbook. First thing I do, as ever with a table, is rename it. This is going to be called, what should we call it? Should we call it table list, TBL list. And actually this is a list of tables, so we could call it TBL list tables, but I've just called it TBL list for now. What I'm now going to do is refer to this data body range within the table here. I'm going to refer to that in my VBA. So if I go back here and I'm building a loop, and I'm going to say for each item, and I could call it item, thing, thread, file, whatever. And I'm just going to do a little bit of clever code here. I'm going to say in this workbook, and active sheet, and I'm going to refer to list objects, and I specify by name the table that I just called. So we called it TBL, I think it was list or lists. I can always move to the side to see, and I can see it's list without an S on the end. Now it is important that we refer to this correctly. So list objects does have an S on the end. This is the collection of all the tables within that workbook. That's the workbook we're working on. And TBL list is the name of the specific table that I want. And it's not the entire table, it's just actually the data body range. In other words, the cells below the header, not including the header. So for each item in this workbook, active sheet lists, what do I want to do? Well, I want to run through some stuff, and then underneath there, next item. So that will go back to this point in my code for the next one. Now, here's the trick. What we need to do is, for each one, we've called it item, but what it's referring to is an item here within the table. So my first item in the loop will be TBL products. What I actually want to do is replace every instance here of TBL cashiers with not TBL products, but item. So here, let's go ahead. This first one here does not any longer need the speech marks because it's not going to be a text field. It's now going to be a code field. So that's the value of that variable that's coming in. And some of the others are not going to be the same. So as I scroll across here, we're looking for any other instances of that cashier table. Now this one here, TBL cashiers, that bit there we want to replace with item. But we need to do this in a specific way. We need to shut down the text, the speech that's coming in at the moment, and then insert our field inside. So I've selected TBL cashiers. I'm going to put some speech marks, and I'm going to move inside the speech marks and just do some concatenation there. And so basically I'm saying all the text before this point and whatever item is, and then all the text after that point. I need to do the same again here. So as I'm going through, what I'm doing is two quotes and then a step to the left. So now I'm inside those two quotes I've just put in there. Two spaces and a step to the left. Two ampersands, step to the left. Two spaces, step to the left. Now I'm right in the middle. I can put in my text or my parameter item, and I'll look along, see if I've got any other instances of it, and I do have here. So I'll do exactly the same there. Quotes, quotes, left, space, space, left, and left, space, space, left, item. So item is the variable, which is the name of the first, so in this case TBL products. Okay, so that's it. That would actually build the query and run the query with no problem. What we're now going to do is create the connection, and here's where I said it's important that you've named the file correctly when you save it, and that you've saved it with the correct file type, because that's referred to here in the VBA. I'm now going to do exactly the same again, so I'm going to come across here. I'll just do my same thing again, quotes, quotes, step to the left, and then item. And I'm going to do the same for anywhere where I see it. Being particularly careful, like here, that is actually inside speech marks already, but there's speech marks within speech marks. But again, if we make sure we've closed the same type of speech marks that are defined outside, we should be fine. And we do need to make sure we spell everything correctly as we're going through here. Let's see if it finds it. And one more there. Speech marks, space, and space, item. And I believe we've got one more to do at the bottom here. And that's that one there. And exactly the same again. Okay, so let's now see if that all works, and what we're going to do is step through it slowly just to see if it does. So that's loaded, that's this one here, and that's given me my TBL list. So as we go through it, I'll move this out the way as we go. So I'm just simply going to click on here and press F8 to step through the data. So at the moment, item has not been filled. As soon as I click OK, item has now been filled with the first element from that table. As I go down here, now that refers to TBL product, and you'll notice that there it's in speech marks, even though the word item is not, because the word item is a command, it's a variable, whereas the answer to it is TBL products is text, because it's got it as text from the other table. Okay, when I press F8 now, it's executed that line of code. So if I go back here, we can actually see that we have TBL products loaded, but as a connection only. Now when I go back here, F8 again, it's actually running it, and it ran the query, and it's now loaded all of the rows for that query. Okay, we're back here, we're on next item. So if I F8 again, it goes back in the loop. Now this time when I hover over item, you'll see it's TBL cashiers, which is the second one down in the list there. We've got a total of 5 to go through, so rather than going through each one, I can either hit F5 or hit that button there to continue. It will run through, it does take a few seconds to do so, but it will load all of those different queries, and they are queries, so each table will be loaded as its own query into the Excel, not into the workbook, but into the data model for the workbook. And if we now shift back to Excel, we'll see all of these loaded here, and they're all loaded correctly. The last one was still loading whilst we looked at it, so TBL tills has now completely loaded. Okay, up to now, I hope this has been useful. It's very useful for anybody who wants to load stuff into Excel, but of course we want to take it a stage further. I'm just going to save this file, and as soon as it's saved, I'm just going to close it down and open Power BI. Because Power BI, as we all know, can actually import a data model directly from Excel. It does require your architecture to be the same for both of your products. So your Power BI needs to be 64-bit and your Excel needs to be 64-bit. It won't work if one of them is 32. So that's fine. Just waiting on Power BI loading up. It does take a while to load Power BI, and the reason is because really you're telling a laptop to load up a database. We'll see this coming up, and I'm just going to cancel the dialog that comes up first of all, the welcome screen, and then we will start a new workbook. But what we're going to do is we're going to import, and we're going to import from a Power Query. Power Query referring to Excel in this instance. So I'm going to go and find the one that I've just created, and rather than just saying an Excel file, I'll say all files, because that will then show the one that's the XLSM file. So if you don't see your file there, it's just looking for XLSX. And if I click open there, that will now give me a warning message telling me it's not going to bring everything in from the Excel, but what it will do is it will bring in the data model, and that's what we care about. So that's why it was important to make sure everything was loaded to the data model. Now it's running through, it's creating the queries, it's going to test everything, and we see we have no errors there. It has also loaded in my table, but rather than it going on the worksheet in Excel, it's actually gone in to my queries over here. When I click close, sorry, you can scroll down to see if you had any errors there. When I click close, if I go to my data model here, we'll be able to see all of the queries that we loaded. All of them have been loaded into the data model in Power BI as individual queries, and that is often very useful to people. Okay, that was it in a nutshell. I hope you found that useful, and once again, as always, thank you for listening.